Welcome to the Old Testament Made Simple, lesson number 10. Thank you for joining us for this series. We appreciate everybody that has participated in the series thus far. We always want to thank Mr. Melton Short for the opportunity to bring this study to you. What we're trying to accomplish is 8 trips through the entire Old Testament to get a skeleton view of the Old Testament. From this skeleton view, you have a place to put additional information, and it makes understanding the Old Testament, the flow of the Old Testament, the books of the Old Testament, much easier to understand going forward. So I hope you're keeping up with your lessons. Hope you're enjoying the study so far. We have already taken 6 trips through the Old Testament. We've gone through the geographical moves of the children of Israel throughout the Old Testament. We have gone through the 20 key people of the Old Testament. We've covered the 3 major divisions of the Old Testament. We've looked at the 11 books that contain 95% of the story. We've looked at a way to remember the contents of each book. We looked at God's 7 major covenants with man. And today we're going to look at the 5 major time periods of the Old Testament. Wow, we've covered a lot of information in the last 9 weeks. And we're going to add through this lesson today the 5 major time periods and put a lot of this information together. This is a very exciting lesson to me because this begins the process of putting it all together. Next week in lesson number 11, we will look at the 50 major events of the Old Testament. But today we want to begin to group all of this information into one little box so that you can see it all come together. The idea of this is so that you can lay in your bed at night with the lights out and go through the entire Old Testament in skeleton form. So I hope that you're memorizing this information. I hope that you're taking a little bit of extra time to go back over your notes and to dig into this information. I promise you, once you have a good, clear understanding of all this information, the Old Testament will make a lot more sense to you. And reading the Old Testament will be a lot easier. All right, Jason is enjoying pointing out our geography for us, so we'll have him come and point out the geography on our map for us. All right, take your time and let's do it in order. All right, what's outside the back corner? Point to it on the map and tell me.
Persian Gulf.
Persian Gulf. The city just to the north?
Ur.
Very good. What is the land up around the room to the back corner on the opposite side?
The Fertile Crescent.
The Fertile Crescent. Very good. Beyond that wall, what is the body of water?
Mediterranean Sea.
The Mediterranean Sea. And the city just to the south? The nation
Egypt.
just to the south? Egypt. And the city, nation just up in the Fertile Crescent?
Israel.
Israel. Very good. All right, and what is this land in between?
The desert.
The desert. All right, very good. Now let's go back and let's name our rivers. 3 major rivers in and around the Fertile Crescent. What's the river to the north?
Euphrates.
Nope.
Tigris.
Tigris River. The river to the south?
Euphrates.
The Euphrates River. And the river in Israel?
Jordan River.
The Jordan River. Very good. Very good. All right. When the children of Israel left Egypt, they crossed a body of water. God helped them. What is it?
The Red Sea.
The Red Sea. Good. Moses stopped at Mount Sinai and got what?
The 10 Commandments.
Very good. Where's Mount Sinai? Right there. Very good. Now they wandered in the wilderness for a period of time before going into Israel, and they stopped at a land right before going into Israel. What's the name of that land?
Moab.
Moab. Very good. Now when Abraham left Ur, he moved to where?
Haran.
Haran, up there. Point to it so everybody can see. Haran, very good, very good. Now the children of Israel were taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar to a city called
Babylon.
Babylon. And Babylon is right there between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. Very good. Now where did it all begin?
Eden.
Eden. Very good. All right, now let's do our major moves. You ready? You ready?
Yeah.
All right, move number 1.
Eden to Ur.
Eden to Ur. Move number 2.
Ur to Haran.
Ur to Haran. Move number 3.
Haran to Israel.
Move number 4.
Israel to Egypt.
Point it out. Israel to Egypt. All right, move number 5.
Egypt to Israel.
Move number 6.
Israel to Babylon.
Move number 7.
Babylon to Israel.
Very good. Awesome. Good job, Jason. Perfect. All right, now we want to do the 20 key people of the Old Testament. Emery, do you want to do the 20 key people of the Old Testament? Come on, I'll help you. I promise. She wanted to do the moves and I forgot. I got carried away with Jason. All right, the 20 key people. What are the 6 in Genesis?
Adam.
Adam.
Noah.
You want to point them out? Adam, Noah, Abraham,
Isaac.
Isaac,
And Jacob.
Jacob, and his son,
Joseph.
Joseph. Very good. Now, Israel had 11 leaders. Their first leader led them out of Egypt, and who was that? Moses. Very good. And then their next leader was the young man that served as one of the spies. He said Israel could take the land. His name was Joshua. Caleb, she always says Caleb. That's all right. And then after Joshua, who was our next leader? They in the sin cycle, the 12 judges. Awesome. And the last judge and the first prophet? Samuel. Excellent. Now we move to our kings. Gets a little easier. Who was our first king? Saul. Very good. Our second king? David. And our third king? David's son built the temple, wrote a love story in the Bible, Song of Solomon. Yay! I hope everyone is following along. Okay, who after Solomon died, the kingdom split into 2. How many kings did we have of the 39 kings of the divided kingdom? They went to Babylon. They were in bondage in Babylon for 70 years. They came back and had 3 leaders. Zerubbabel, awesome. Ezra. And then Nehemiah, outstanding. And then the other 3 of our 20 key people are Pharaoh, very good. Nebuchadnezzar. The prophets. Outstanding. Good job, Anne-Marie. She had not studied to do that part. But she aces this part as well. So we'll go over that. The 3 major divisions of the Old Testament forms the letter H. We have 17 historical books, 5 poetical, 17 prophetical. These are also divided into 5 and 12. The 5 books of the law written by Moses are called what? The Pentateuch. Yay, very good. The Pentateuch. So let's name the first 5 books of the Bible. Ready? Jason's going to help us. What's the first book of the Bible? Genesis. Exodus. Leviticus. Numbers. Deuteronomy. Very good. Very good. Now we're going to start the next section with Joshua. Judges. Ruth. 1st and 2nd Samuel.
1st and 2nd Kings.
1st and 2nd Kings.
1st and 2nd Chronicles.
1st and 2nd Chronicles. Ezra. Nehemiah. And we mustn't forget Esther. Very good. Now we have 5 books of poetry. What are the 5 books of poetry? Job. Psalms. Proverbs. Ecclesiastes.
Song of Solomon.
And the Song of Solomon. Very good. Now the 5 major prophets. Isaiah. Jeremiah. Lamentations. Ezekiel. Daniel. Very good. Now the 12 minor prophets. Hosea. Joel. Amos. Obadiah. Jonah. Micah. Nahum. Habakkuk. Zephaniah. Haggai. Zechariah. And Malachi. Very good. And that gives us our 3 major divisions of the Old Testament and the books of the Old Testament. I hope you're learning the books of the Old Testament. It's very important. You learn the names of the books, where they are, and a little bit about each book. How to remember the contents of the 17 historical books. Now, these 11 books contain the story of the Old Testament. Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So now let's think about the content of that book. What all am I going to find in the book of Genesis? Creation to the death of Joseph in Egypt, all in the book of Genesis. What am I going to find in Exodus?
The mass departure of Egypt.
The mass departure. The children of Israel leaving Egypt and going to the promised land. Very good. Numbers. What will I find in the book of Numbers? The 2 major censuses. They counted the people after they left Egypt, and they counted the people before they went into the promised land. That is what we find in the book of Numbers. Now the rest of these, it gives me an idea by the name of the book as to what I'm going to find in the book. Okay? So the name of the book is Joshua. What will I find in the book of Joshua?
The takeover of Canaan.
The takeover of Canaan. Joshua's military conquest of the land of Canaan. But mainly all the information about Joshua, or a lot of the information about Joshua. What will I find in Judges?
The story of the sin cycles.
The story of the sin cycle, the 12 judges, and the 400 years that they spent going about in different directions. There was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. Okay, 1st and 2nd Samuel tells the story of Samuel the prophet, but it also tells us something else. What will I find in 1 Samuel?
Him trying to find Saul and set the first king.
Setting up the first king of Israel. In 1 Samuel, we'll see Samuel's life as a child and him growing up, and we'll see Saul being anointed as the first king. What will I find in 2 Samuel?
His search for David and David's reign.
His search for David and David's reign as king of Israel. Very good. Now in 1 Kings, we're going to be talking about the kings, of course, but in 1 Kings, what might I find? The reign of which king? If I have Saul and David, Solomon. Very good. 1 Kings, I find mainly the story of Solomon and his kingdom, plus the prophet Elijah. 2 Kings, what will I find?
All the other kings.
The remaining kings of the divided kingdom. Very good. In 1 Kings, we'll get a little bit, at the death of Solomon, we'll get a few kings. But then in 2 Kings, we get the rest of the kings. In 2 Kings, we also get the story of Elisha, the prophet that followed Elijah. So Elijah in 1 Kings, Elisha in 2 Kings. What will I find in the book of Ezra? Coming back from Babylon. Ezra was one of the leaders that led the return back to Jerusalem. And so we'll find the story of Zerubbabel, the story of Ezra in the book of Ezra. Now what will I find in the book of Nehemiah?
The rebuilding of the temple.
The rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem is what I'll find in Nehemiah. Nehemiah led the return back to the promised land and rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem and established Jerusalem as a state again. So that's what we will find in these books. Now, the other 6 books, these 3 are summary books. What does Deuteronomy summarize?
The laws.
Deuteronomy summarizes the law. Why did Moses have to reteach the law?
Because the older generation, they had all passed away.
The older generation died in the 40 years of wilderness wandering, and the new generation had to be taught the law before they went into the promised land. Perfect. So Deuteronomy is a reteaching of the law. 1st and 2nd Chronicles. What will I find here?
The story of the kings.
The story of the kings. Solomon and the Solomon and the kings of the divided kingdom, 20 of which were Judah. What is different about Chronicles versus Kings?
It only talks about Judah's kings.
Chronicles only talks about the kings of Judah. Very good, very important. Now, Ruth and Esther, what are these two books?
They're biographies.
Biographies. Ruth tells the biography of Ruth. Esther tells the biography of Esther. Ruth, how can I remember the contents of the book of Ruth?
Wherever you go, I'll go.
Wherever you go, I will go. Ruth told her mother-in-law Naomi she would follow her back to Israel and her God would be her God. What about Esther?
Perish, I'll perish.
Good job, Jason. If I perish, I perish. Esther was a queen in Babylon and saved her people from being killed. She went before the king and was very brave, trusted God. So she said, if I perish, I perish. She had a cause. It was worthy for her to accomplish that cause, and so she did. Now, what will I find in the book of Leviticus?
The priest's handbook.
The priest's handbook, which tells the priest how to do worship. What was the family name of the priest? Levi. So Leviticus is a priest's handbook for the tribe of Levi to know how to perform worship in God's house. Very good. And a lot of laws and basic information. Want to always go over the sin cycle. They would stray away from God. An enemy nation would oppress them. They would cry out to God. God would raise up a leader. They would serve God while the leader lived. And then when the leader died, they would start the cycle all over again. We can get into this cycle in our own lives. We can serve God for a while, then stray away from God. God has to get our attention. We repent. We do what God helps us through the problem we're facing. And then for a period of time, we do what we're supposed to do. So we can get into this same cycle in our own lives if we're not careful. After the death of Solomon, we divided into two nations, two kingdoms. In the north, we had the nation of Israel, 10 tribes, capital was Samaria. They had 19 kings, and none of them were good. In the south, we had Judah, 2 tribes. Jerusalem was the capital. They had 20 kings, and 8 of those kings were good kings. Okay? So God spent a lot of time nurturing this southern kingdom. Through this southern kingdom, the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, God would bring the Messiah. Okay? So the Messiah came out of the tribe of Judah. Jesus is said to be the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So Judah was important, and God worked through these kings to maintain the church throughout this period of time. Okay? Now we have the 5 poetical books. What would I find in Job?
His life and
His life and suffering. The issues that go around human suffering. And it shows us that suffering is not necessarily because the person is evil, but it's because we live in a sin-cursed world. And Satan has free reign to do as he chooses. So God allowed Satan to cause Job to suffer. Did Job lose his salvation? No. He held true all the way through. Good. Psalms. What will I find in Psalms? Poetry, songs, and things about the soul and the soul's emotions and feelings toward God. What will I find in Proverbs?
Living with God's wisdom.
Wisdom. All through Proverbs we find tons of phrases that give us godly wisdom. And you'll find a lot of proverbs have drifted into everyday culture. So that's very important. What will I find in Song of Solomon?
God's love for us and love for other people.
God's love for us and human love for others. Very good. Ecclesiastes?
The riddle of man's existence.
Riddle of man's existence. Very good. Very good. All right. I hope you're following along and absorbing some of this into your memory so that you'll have it forever. Now, as we look at what to find in the 17 prophetical books, it's important to know when the person preached. Now, all the prophetical books are sermons. The prophet was preaching to the children of Israel or to surrounding nations. They were all sermons. So, in order to know the contents, we need to know when they preached and to whom they preached. Okay, so when did the sermon get preached and to who was the preacher preaching? All right, so with the 17 prophetical books, they all revolve around the Babylonian captivity or exile. Children of Israel spent 70 years in Babylon. And so all of the prophets preached either before, during, or after the Babylonian captivity. So when we're determining the when, it was either before, during, or after. The last three major prophets were during the exile. Okay? The last three minor prophets were after the exile. All of the rest of the prophets were before. Okay? So let's look at that. The five major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel, the last three were during the exile. Okay? Of our 12 minor prophets, the last three, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, were after the exile. All of the rest were before. Okay, so if you can learn these three, and if you can learn these three, then you know all of the rest were before. Okay? Now, to whom? Who did they preach? All but 5 of the prophets were to the southern kingdom of Judah. All but 5. So, the rest of the 17 were all to somebody else. The rest of the 17 were all to Judah. But these 5, and they spell out the word Jonah, if you look at the first letter of the book, these 5 were to other nations. Okay? So they spell out Jonah. Jonah, Obadiah, Nahum, Amos, and Hosea. These 5 preached to somebody other than Judah. Jonah and Nahum preached to Nineveh, the Assyrians. Obadiah, Edom. Amos and Hosea, the northern kingdom of Israel. Everybody else preached to Judah. Okay? Now, 7 major covenants. These covenants we went over last week, they give us the flow of history and the flow of the Bible. It gives us the storyline. As God, it changed from time to time his covenant with man, brought on by man's disobedience or man's issues. The first one was the Edenic covenant. This covenant was in the Garden of Eden. God created Adam and Eve, placed them in the garden, told them to subdue the land. They were to be over the animals. They were to replenish the earth. All they were not supposed to do was to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil from the center of the garden. That was the only thing they could not eat from. Everything else they could eat from. Well, they messed up. The devil deceived them. They were kicked out of the garden. So God gave them a new covenant, the Adamic covenant. Man would have to work for his food. It would not just be readily available to him. Children would be born painfully. There would be pain in childbirth. And there would be briars and thorns and thistles grow up through the land. So the Adamic covenant did not take away God's relationship with man, but it made man's life very difficult, and it made it hard for man to go forward. Adam and Eve were able to do that, and they were able to train their children to do that, and the lineage continued. The Noahic covenant, God made a covenant with Noah. Noah was the only man that found grace in God's eyes. Everybody else was totally wicked throughout the entire world, and so God chose Noah and his family. He had Noah build an ark. Noah built the ark, and God said through Noah, I would replenish the earth. And so he started over. All the people in the world were killed except for Noah and his family. So the Noahic covenant, Noah trusted God, and he found favor in God's eyes. As soon as he got off the ark, if you remember the story, he made a sacrifice to God and began to worship God. The next covenant we find is the Abrahamic covenant. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. The very center of the Bible as far as time is concerned. God made a covenant with Abraham that through Abraham he would make him a great nation, and through his seed all families of the earth would be blessed. The nation that God made out of Abraham is the nation of Israel. That nation is still in existence today, and God said he would bless all people of the earth through his seed. That was Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ is on the throne today. So God made a covenant with Abraham, and that covenant is still in effect today. Now, years later, when God led the children of Israel out of Egypt, Moses received the 10 Commandments. The children of Israel heard the 10 Commandments audibly as God spoke them. Moses received them written on stone from God, and that's the 10 Commandments. Then the Davidic covenant, David desired to build God a house. They were in the promised land. They had subdued a lot of their enemies. Moses had built a tabernacle, which was a tent for God to reside in. That was their church, if you will, a tent. David lived in a house made of cedar, and he wanted God to have a house made of cedar. So David loved the Lord. The Bible says that David was a man after God's own heart. So God made a covenant with David. He said, David, because you have desired to build me a house out of the goodness of your heart, you will always have an heir on the throne. In other words, one of David's descendants would always be king in Israel. When Jesus Christ came in the New Testament and died on the cross and rose on the third day, he's alive today. Jesus was a descendant of David, and Jesus is our eternal king. So God has made that covenant continue even until today. When God makes a covenant, he doesn't break it. Mankind breaks it. Jesus Christ is the new covenant. When Christ came, he said, if you will believe in me, confess your sins, you can live in heaven eternally forever. And that's our new covenant that we live under today. So those are all of our covenants. Now we start into actually the meat of our lesson for today. It's a lot of information that we're going to try to stick together here in the next few minutes. So let's just jump right in. The 5 major time periods. Now we want to look at the entire Old Testament, and we want to look at when things happen, okay? And what goes together. So this is going to be a lot of information. We'll throw it at you quickly, and then we'll try to go over it in our next session, even more detail, hopefully. All right, we have the 5 major time periods. Time period number 1 would have to start where? In Eden, of course. Time period number 1 starts in Eden, because that's where it all began. So time period number 1 is before Israel became a nation. Okay? Number 1 is before Israel became a nation. That's our first time period. So that covers everything from Eden until the children of Israel are in Egypt, okay? And we'll come back to that. Number 2, our second time period, Israel in Egypt, okay? Israel in Egypt. Our time period number 3 is Israel in the wilderness. We're going to go into a little bit more detail in just a second. Number 4 is back in the promised land. And number 5 is the exile and beyond. Okay? Now we're going to dig into those. That gives you an overview of the 5 time periods. Before Israel became a nation, Israel in Egypt, Israel in the wilderness, back in the promised land, and the exile and beyond. All right. Now once we put these together, you're going to go, wow, that's amazing. All right. Time period number 1, before Israel became a nation, covers from creation till the death of Joseph in Egypt, and is a period of over 2,000 years. Okay? So from creation to Joseph's death in Egypt is time period number 1. All right, who are the key people? Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. All right? And where do we find that? In the book of Genesis. Wow. All right, so Genesis covers over a 2,300 year period of time. We go from creation to the death of Joseph in Egypt. And these are our main people: Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Genesis. All right? Now, what major moves occurred during this first time period? Well, we got Abraham, we've got Adam, so we went from Adam, which was in the Garden of Eden, move number 1, Eden to Ur. Move number 2, Ur to Haran. Move number 3, Haran to Israel. And move number 4, Israel to Egypt. So all of this occurred in our first time period. Okay? Now, what major covenants? Wow, looky here. The Edenic covenant God made with Adam and Eve. Then the Adamic covenant that God made with Adam after they were kicked out of the garden. Then the Noahic covenant that God made with Noah before and after the flood. And then the Abrahamic covenant that God made with Abraham. Wow. All of this occurred in time period number 1 in the book of Genesis. All right? So the plot of the Bible was established. God moved his chosen people to the promised land and then into Egypt. Now the nation of Israel in number 4, move number 4 from Israel to Egypt, they were only 70 people. Okay? So 70 people went into Egypt. Time period number 1, before Israel became a nation. All right, now let's go to time period number 2. All right, time period number 2, Israel in Egypt. This was the next 430 years. The nation grew from 70 people to over 2 million. Okay? Now, as a result of this rapid growth of the population of the Israelites, Pharaoh became afraid of them. And he began killing the firstborn son, or all of the male children of the Hebrews. That brings us to the story of Moses. His mom saw that he was a goodly child. She put him in a basket and floated him out in the river so that Pharaoh's daughter would see him and have compassion on him, and he would be taken into the palace. So, the time period number 2 was the children of Israel in the 400 plus years that they stayed in Egypt. Now, the key people of time period number 2 is Moses and Pharaoh. Because as we look at this, we get the story of Moses, the story of Pharaoh, Pharaoh's daughter, and then God trying to get Pharaoh to let the people go. So what book? Time period number 2 we find in the book of Exodus. Okay? What major moves? Well, it begins move number 5, from Egypt back to Israel. Okay? So we get the first part of move number 5 in the second time period. What leader? Moses. What major covenant? None. No covenant was made in time period number 2. Okay? Alright? So, time period number 2, Israel in Egypt, 430 years. Main characters, Moses and Pharaoh. The book of Exodus. Move number 5 begins. The leader, of course, Moses, and no covenant. Alright, now, time period number 3. Israel in the wilderness, 40 years. The children of Israel spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness. The spies, they sent one spy from every tribe of the 12 tribes of Israel. They sent them into the promised land to scout out the promised land of Canaan, the land that God had promised to Abraham. The land where God promised Abraham he'd make him a great nation. And the land where God promised that he would bless all families of the earth through his descendants. This land. So they were headed there from Egypt. But when they got there, sent the spies in. 10 come back and said, we can't do it. 2 said, yes, we can. We can do it. We can take it. That was Joshua and Caleb. So, as a result of their disobedience, God sent them back into the desert, back into the wilderness. And they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. So time period number 3 was the years of 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Key people, again, Moses was the leader through this entire period of time. The book where we find that is the last part of Exodus and the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers is the census. The census when they left Egypt and the census before they went into the promised land. Okay? So Exodus and Numbers, the last part of Exodus and the book of Numbers gives us time period number 3. Major moves, they complete move number 5. Egypt back to Israel. And it's in progress throughout this entire period of time. The leader, Moses. The covenant, the 10 commandments. The Mosaic covenant. God makes with the children of Israel. He actually speaks the law to them, and it's recorded for them. Time period number 3. Moses. Books, Exodus and Numbers. Major moves, number 5. Egypt back to Israel. Leader, Moses. Major covenant, the Mosaic covenant. Okay? 40 years. Very good. All right. Now, time period number 4. Back in the promised land. Now, this is after Joshua leads the children of Israel into the promised land. They begin to conquer the land. That's what time period we're talking about. All through the kings. Saul as king, David as king, the 39 kings of the divided kingdom. All of this occurs in time period number 4. The next 1,000 years. This is the height of Israel as a society. Okay? During this 1,000 year period of time, Israel achieved its greatest level of success and then drifted into oblivion. So time period number 4 gives us the height of the nation of Israel. Under David, David was the best general king that Israel had. He conquered land and expanded Israel's borders to the largest degree that it ever had been. And has been since. It's never been as great as it was under David. Solomon had peace during the years that he was king, during time period number 4, and he built God a temple. And kings and queens from all over the world flowed into Israel to hear Solomon's wisdom and to see the temple of God. All of this occurred in time period number 4, 1,000 years. We have a lot of key people in this period of time. Key people, Joshua. He led the initial conquest, the 12 judges, the period of time, 400 plus years, that they were in the sin cycle. God would raise up a judge. Then Samuel, who his sons were disobedient to God, and the people rejected his sons, didn't want his sons to rule over them or to judge them, and they demanded a king of Samuel. So Samuel consulted God. God said, go ahead. And the first king was Saul, second king David, Solomon, 39 kings of the divided kingdom, and then the prophets. These are the key people, the key stories that are going on during time period number 4. And the books that you will find this story in: Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. Okay? Major moves, they didn't move. They were stable in their land for this 1,000-year period of time. So like I said, this is the height of the nation of Israel. Even to this day, Israel's splendor is not what it was during this particular period of time. So time period number 4, back in the promised land, 1,000 years. The leaders: Joshua, the 12 judges, Samuel, Saul, David, Solomon, and the 39 kings of the divided kingdom. The major covenant was the Davidic covenant. God made the promise to David that he would always have an heir on the throne. That occurred in time period number 4. Okay? A lot of information. Okay, now, time period number 5, the exile and beyond. Where were the children of Israel exiled? Babylon. Very good. So this is the 70 years that the children of Israel would spend in Babylon. Now, the 10 tribes in the north had already been destroyed by the Assyrians and scattered. Judah and Benjamin in the south, the nation of Judah, was taken captive by Babylon. And this is move number 6 and move number 7. All right, so 70 years in Babylon, and then they returned to Jerusalem. They rebuilt their houses. They rebuilt God's house. They rebuilt the city walls. And then Jewish history continued until the time of Jesus Christ. Okay? So that's time period number 5. From the exile, from the time they went into Babylon, until the time they come back, until the time of Jesus Christ, is time period number 5. The last time period in the Old Testament. All right? Now the key people: Nebuchadnezzar. Who was he?
He was a king of Babylon.
Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. Very good. God used him. Through Nebuchadnezzar, we have the stories of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the fiery furnace. Okay? Then the other key people during this time period were the prophets, and then leaders. And we'll get to them down here as well. But key people: Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Okay? The books: 2nd Kings, the last part of 2nd Kings is when they were taken captive to Babylon. And then the return: Ezra, Nehemiah. And then while in Babylon, Daniel and Ezekiel. So in all of these books, you'll find time period number 5. Okay? Now, Daniel and Ezekiel wasn't mentioned in our 11 books that contain 95% of the narrative, okay? So that other 5%, part of it comes out of the book of Daniel and out of Ezekiel. Because when you read Daniel and you read Ezekiel, you get more information about the Babylonian captivity. All right. Now, major moves. Move number 6, Israel to Babylon. And move number 7, Babylon back to Israel. What leaders do we have during this period of time? Zerubbabel, who led the first return. Ezra, who led the second return. And Nehemiah, who led the last return. The major covenant, there was no major covenant during this time period. Okay? All right. Now, let's put it all together again. The 5 major time periods. Before Israel became a nation, how much time involved? How many years? 2,000. More than 2,000 years. Israel in Egypt, how much time?
400.
Around 430 years. Israel in the wilderness, 40 years. Back in the promised land, 1,000 years. And move number 5, the exile and beyond. 70 years in exile, and then everything up until the time of Jesus Christ. Okay? All right, very good. That's our lesson for today. Next week, we will look at the 50 major events of the Old Testament. Once we look at those 50 major events, you will have your skeleton view of the entire Old Testament. And then lesson number 12 will put it all together. So we have 2 lessons left. Hang in there with us. I know it was a lot of information today, but go back and kind of dot your I's and cross your T's and put it all together. But thank you for joining us.